Some countries are shaped by history, others by conflict, and some are shaped by both. Iran is one of those countries, a nation of ancient empires, modern tensions, and an uncertain future. Iran, a country in the heart of the Middle East, connecting Asia to Europe, and home to more than 93 million people. Its capital, Tehran, a vast city surrounded by mountains, where millions live, work, and move every day. For many young Iranians, life is vibrant, social, and full of energy, despite the pressures around them. The young are educated, defiant, trendsetters, and enjoying life despite the current situation. Young women are not wearing headscarves in public, a choice they feel are theirs and should not be part of the law. Despite the weight of international sanctions, the capital is surging forward. You'll find a landscape of sleek modern construction and a thriving cafe culture fueled by a growing middle class. It's a city defined by energy. Over 60% of the population is under the age of 39. From food to culture to daily routines, Iran is a country rich in tradition and modern life. But beyond everyday life, Iran is rarely seen this way in the global spotlight.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
We are facing an act of aggression, and obviously we have every right to defend ourselves.
In recent years, protests have spread across the country, driven by economic hardship and demands for change. The government has responded with force, using arrests, restrictions, and control over information. At the same time, tensions beyond its borders continue to rise, pushing the region closer to conflict. Iran launches missiles and drones to Israel, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. At the center of global concern is Iran's nuclear program and its uranium enrichment. After President Donald Trump canceled the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018 during his first term, tensions between the U.S. and Iran increased, and with Trump's second term, it has escalated. Inside Iran, life continues only under pressure and uncertainty. But Iran's story did not begin here. To understand today, we must go back over 100 years. At the start of the 20th century, Iran was known as Persia, a land shaped by centuries of empire, but now facing decline. The country was ruled by Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar, weak and indebted to both Great Britain, Russia, and France. He signed the Darcy Concession in 1901 to William Knox Darcy, giving him the exclusive rights to oil in most of the country. He is credited with the creation of the Persian Constitution of 1906, which he approved of in one of his final acts as Shah. He died of a heart attack 40 days after granting this constitution. His son Muhammad Ali Shah Qajar was crowned as the next Shah of Persia, and he had plans to change his father's acts. In 1907, Muhammad Ali dissolved the National Consultative Assembly and declared the constitution abolished because it was contrary to Islamic law. He bombarded the Persian parliament, known at the time as Majlis, with the military and political support of Russia and Britain. He enlisted the help of the Cossack Brigade to control the revolution, leaving the city of Tehran at their mercy. Arrests were made of the parliament members. However, in July 1909, pro-constitution forces marched from Iran's Azerbaijan province to Tehran. They were able to capture Tehran, depose the Shah in favor of his son, Ahmad Shah Qajar, and re-establish the constitution. The rebels then convened the Grand Modules of 500 delegates from different backgrounds, which placed Ahmad Shah, Muhammad Ali's 11-year-old son, on the Sun throne. Due to his young age, his uncle, Ali Reza Khan Azad Almat, governed as regent. The Grand Majlis enacted many reforms. They abolished class representation and created 5 new seats in the Majlis for minorities, 2 seats for Armenians, and 1 seat each for Jews, Zoroastrians, and Assyrians. The Majlis also democratized the electoral system, diminished the electoral dominance of Tehran, and even lowered the voting age from 25 to 20. And then oil was discovered. According to the agreement with Darcy, Iran will only receive 16% of the annual revenue, an amount Iran would not be able to use and instead pay off for their debt owed to Britain. Ahmad Shah Qajar, a young monarch, is now facing World War I. The war and drought brought the country famine. And there is also the rise of the Soviet Union on the doorstep. Britain attempted to use Persia as a springboard for an attack into Russia in an unsuccessful attempt to reverse the Russian Revolution of 1917. The newly born Soviet Union responded by annexing portions of northern Persia as buffer states, much like its Tsarist predecessor. The young and weak Ahmad Shah, who was often absent in Europe, visit UK, Germany, and France. The central government was so ineffective that it had gone through 51 cabinets. Central control had evaporated, leaving the country at the mercy of independent tribal forces, regional revolts, and rampant banditry. While the young Shah was away, the Persian Socialist Soviet Republic in Rasht was preparing to march on Tehran with a guerrilla force supported by the Red Army, creating an acute political crisis in the capital. Britain had attempted to turn Iran into a virtual protectorate through the 1919 agreement, which would have given them control over the Iranian military and treasury. Strong nationalist opposition in the Majlis parliament prevented the treaty's ratification, leaving the British without a legal way to secure their interests or protect the oil fields. Frustrated by the Qajar government's incompetence, British General Edmund Ironside decided to support a local military alternative. Ironside personally handpicked Reza Khan to lead the Cossack Brigade into Tehran, viewing a military-led government as the only way to establish a security belt against communism and stabilize the region for British trade in oil. Born into a military family in Mazandaran, Reza Khan rose from a humble private to commander of the elite Cossack Brigade. A fierce nationalist with little formal education, he grew frustrated by Iran's weakness and foreign interference. In 1921, he led a British-backed coup, seizing Tehran. It was swift and largely bloodless military takeover, with critical behind-the-scenes support from British military officials. Once in control, the forces arrested nearly 60 high-ranking government officials and members of the Qajar elite to prevent organized opposition. Backed by his troops, Reza Khan forced the dissolution of the existing cabinet. He pressured the terrified Ahmad Shah to appoint Saeed Zia as prime minister and himself as Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief. As Minister of War, Reza Khan had already become the de facto power in Iran, controlling the only disciplined national military force. He successfully weakened and divided his political opponents over 2 years, making his rise to the premiership nearly inevitable. Ahmad Shah Qajar formally appointed Reza Khan as prime minister on 28th of October 1923. Immediately after the appointment, the young and often ill Ahmad Shah left Iran for Europe, leaving Reza Khan as the sole ruler of the country. He never returned. Reza Khan held this position until 1925, when the Iranian parliament Majlis officially deposed the Qajar dynasty and elected him as the new Shah. He immediately took residence in the palace. Reza Shah Pahlavi's official coronation took place on the 25th April 1926 at Golestan Palace in Tehran, the same historic site used by the Qajar kings to maintain a sense of royal continuity. Although the parliament had officially declared him Shah on 12 December 1925, and he took his imperial oath 3 days later, the formal ceremony was held months later to finalize the establishment of the Pahlavi dynasty. He had a vision for Iran. His goal was clear: to build a strong, modern, independent Iran. But the country is still behind compared to his Turkish and Russian counterparts. And money was tight. But before reforming, he needed access to the treasury. So he reduced the role of the Majlis. He shifted Iran's system from a constitutional monarchy toward a one-man system, where the parliament simply ratified his decrees. After his coronation in 1926, Reza Shah Pahlavi transformed Iran through a program of rapid, top-down modernization and centralization intended to turn the country into a strong, secular nation-state. He immediately started with military reform. He created Iran's first standing national army, expanding it from 22,000 to over 120,000 men loyal to him. He wanted to make sure they were only loyal to him. So he removed all the other military personnel who had higher rank than him before becoming a Shah. He modernized the army, bought latest military equipments and weapons, and promoted those close to him in ranks and power. His next reform was the bureaucratic expansion. He grew the civil service to 90,000 workers and reorganized provincial administrations to eliminate the power of semi-autonomous tribal leaders. A plan to create a Trans-Iranian railway was on the way. The cornerstone of his economic plan, this massive project connected the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf without relying on foreign loans. He also planned to build roads and highways to connect major cities. These plans were vital for Iran, as they would have allowed isolated cities to receive imports from ports much more quickly. These plans would also have grown the economy, allowing his vision of westernization to progress much more smoothly and quickly. It would also enable his military to respond swiftly to any uprising across Iran. It also created a lot of work for the citizens of Iran, which decreased unemployment, bolstered his popularity, and brought prosperity to his reign. By then, the country was growing economically, the urban population was increasing, and major projects had made people flock to Tehran. It became one of the largest cities in the world. Public transportation was expanded significantly, with the introduction of more trams, buses, and private vehicles. With all the public spending, money was running out. The Shah needed a solution. He could not raise taxes now. He already did with the new progressive income tax, which jumped from 0.5% to 4%. The government attempted to cap high corporate profit rates by imposing a 12% limit. He needed money fast. In the early 1930s, Iran's oil revenues plummeted by 75% due to the Great Depression. Frustrated by years of failed talks and British accounting tricks, Reza Shah famously tossed the Darcy concession files into a heater during a cabinet meeting in November 1932, unilaterally canceling the deal. The British responded by sending warships to the Persian Gulf and taking the case to the League of Nations. After months of tension, a new deal was ratified in May 1933. The key changes in the new deal were revenue increase. Iran's share of net profits rose from 16% to 20%. Minimum payments. Britain guaranteed a minimum annual payment of $750,000 to $975,000, protecting Iran from price drops. Land reduction. The area covered by the concession was reduced by roughly 75–80%. Iranianization. The company promised to train and employ more Iranian workers. Name change. In 1935, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. While the deal provided immediate funds for the Shah's modernization projects, it was later viewed as a disaster for Iranian sovereignty because it extended the concession's duration from 1961 to 1993. This 32-year extension ultimately fueled the fierce anti-British sentiment that led to the nationalization of oil in 1951. Reza Shah replaced traditional religious schools, maktabs, with a centralized secular national system. He founded the University of Tehran, 1934, and made primary education free and compulsory for both genders. Reforms focused on Iranism, mandating standardized Persian textbooks to unify national identity. While enrollment grew from 1,400 to 400,000 by 1941, the system remained elitist, with a -% illiteracy rate. He also launched the Women's Awakening in 1936, most famously through the Kashafi hijab, which forcibly banned the veil, chador, in public. He opened schools in the University of Tehran to women and permitted them to work in government offices and the medical field. While these reforms increased public visibility and education for urban women, the brutal police enforcement alienated many religious families, often leaving traditional women housebound to avoid the ban. Reza Shah replaced the lunar Islamic calendar with the solar Hijri calendar. He restored ancient Persian month names, like Farvardin, to replace Arabic ones, reinforcing nationalist identity over religious ties. While he kept the migration of Muhammad as the starting point, the shift to a solar system aligned the year with the seasons and the Persian New Year, Nowruz. This move was a key part of his effort to secularize the state and modernize national administration. He used archaeology to glorify pre-Islamic Persia and cement a new national identity. He ended the French monopoly on excavations, established the National Museum of Iran, and oversaw the restoration of Persepolis. By celebrating the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires, he sought to bypass Islamic history and link his Pahlavi dynasty to the greatness of ancient kings like Cyrus the Great. This Neo-Achaemenid style also defined the era's state architecture. Reza Shah viewed Germany as a vital counterweight to the twin pressures of Britain and the Soviet Union. By 1940, Germany was Iran's largest trading partner, accounting for nearly half of its foreign trade. German firms like Lufthansa, Siemens, and Hochtief built Iran's infrastructure, including the flagship Trans-Iranian Railway and the central bank. When World War II began, the Shah faced immense pressure. He feared the conflict would plunge the country into instability and war. Fearing he would be drawn into the conflict due to his economic ties with Germany and the presence of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the Shah officially declared Iran neutral. When the British and Soviets demanded he expel all German nationals, claiming they were fifth columnists and Nazi spies, Reza Shah refused on the grounds of neutrality and economic necessity. He argued that the several hundred German technicians were essential for running Iran's modern industries, and that summarily deporting them would violate Iranian sovereignty. His stance was also influenced by a personal admiration for German nationalist discipline and the Aryan connections promoted by Nazi propaganda, which he felt elevated Iran's status on the world stage. This alarmed the Allies. After several rounds of negotiations, the Shah remained adamant, refusing to expel the German nationals from Iran. It became apparent that the German Nazis and the Shah had strong ties, with Germany exerting tremendous influence over his administration. In 1941, the Allies invaded Iran to secure the Persian Corridor, a vital supply route to the Soviet Union. Fearful of the German Fifth Column and needing to protect British oil fields in the south, Britain and the USSR demanded Reza Shah expel German nationals. When he refused, citing neutrality, they launched a coordinated assault. The invasion forced his abdication and ensured Allied control over the Trans-Iranian Railway for the remainder of the war. The Iranian military offered only brief symbolic resistance. The navy was destroyed in hours, and the army collapsed within 3 days as Reza Shah ordered a ceasefire to prevent total slaughter. The Shah lost everything. He was forced to abdicate the throne, surrendered his vast personal wealth to the state, and was sent into British-controlled exile, first in Mauritius and then South Africa. Most importantly, he lost his dream of a sovereign, independent Iran. On the 16th September 1941, 21-year-old Mohammad Reza Pahlavi took the throne as a weak monarch. The Majlis seized this opening to reassert authority, ending 2 decades of suppression. Parliament quickly secured the national treasury, passing laws to keep the crown jewels in state vaults as a national reserve. By stripping the Shah of personal control over these assets, the Majlis moved power back to Parliament, ensuring the king would reign, not rule. Prime Minister Haj Ali Razmara was a powerful military leader appointed in 1950 to provide strong government. He was assassinated on 7th of March 1951 by Khalil Thomas Ebi, a member of the militant religious group Fatah-e-Islam. He was vocal opposition to oil nationalization. Just days earlier, he told the Majlis that Iran lacked the technical skills to run the industry. His death removed the final major barrier to Mohammad Mossadegh's rise and the subsequent nationalization of Iranian oil. In April 1951, following the assassination of Prime Minister Razmara, the Majlis nominated Mohammad Mossadegh for the premiership. Mossadegh accepted on the condition that they first pass a law to nationalize the oil industry, which they did unanimously. Recognizing his immense popular support and the unstoppable momentum for oil reform, the Shah formally appointed him prime minister on 28th of April 1951. The relationship was a tense power struggle between a monarch wanting to rule and a prime minister demanding he only reign. Mossadegh viewed the Shah as a weak, inexperienced leader who was too easily manipulated by the British. He treated the Shah with formal respect, but constantly stripped his powers, notably taking control of the military budget. To Mossadegh, the Shah was a constitutional figurehead whose primary job was to stay out of the way of the people's will. From 1951 to 1952, Mossadegh's primary demand was the total nationalization of the oil industry to end British imperial control. He also demanded broad emergency powers to bypass parliamentary deadlock, seeking to implement radical land reforms and tax the wealthy. His goal was to transform the Shah into a figurehead by shifting control of the national budget and government appointments from the palace to the prime minister's office, reflecting his reign, not rule philosophy. By nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the company's shareholders felt betrayed. The oil company campaigned and lobbied the British government to intervene. In 1951, Britain sued Iran at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, claiming oil nationalization violated the 1933 treaty. Mossadegh personally traveled to The Hague, arguing the court lacked jurisdiction because the oil deal was a private contract, not an international treaty. In July 1952, the ICJ ruled in Iran's favor, agreeing it had no authority to intervene. While a massive legal triumph for Mossadegh, it pushed Britain to abandon the law in favor of a total oil blockade. In October 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh addressed the UN Security Council to defend oil nationalization against British claims that it threatened world peace. The topic was whether the UN had jurisdiction over a sovereign nation's domestic resources. The conclusion was a win for Iran. The Council voted to adjourn the case indefinitely. This prevented British-led international sanctions, though it ultimately led Britain to shift from diplomacy to an economic blockade. Truman hosted Mossadegh in 1951, attempting to mediate a compromise that recognized nationalization while keeping oil flowing. Mossadegh sought a private deal, or a $120 million loan to break the British blockade, but Truman refused. He feared a separate deal would undermine global oil contracts and alienate Britain. Despite the friendly reception, the U.S. chose Allied unity over Iranian aid, leaving Mossadegh without the financial lifeline he needed to sustain the economy. After failed mediation, Truman resisted a coup, viewing Iranian nationalism as legitimate. However, during a 1952 meeting, Winston Churchill personally lobbied the U.S. to take a harder line. Despite their friendship, Truman stood firm, fearing an overthrow would push Iran toward the Soviets. He maintained the U.S. should be a neutral mediator, not a colonial tool. It wasn't until the next administration that Churchill's Cold War framing finally triggered the joint plot. When Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953, the U.S. stance shifted. Influenced by his close wartime friendship with Winston Churchill, Eisenhower agreed that Mossadegh was a liability. Churchill's government lobbied hard, reframing the oil dispute as a Cold War crisis rather than a colonial one. They convinced the U.S. that a communist takeover was imminent. By summer, the two allies approved Operation Ajax, a joint CIA MI6 plot to overthrow the prime minister. In 1953, CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr. led Operation Ajax to overthrow Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Operating from Tehran, Roosevelt coordinated with British intelligence and pro-Shah forces. He utilized psychological warfare, media propaganda, and political maneuvering to undermine Mossadegh's support. After an initial failure, Roosevelt mobilized military units and civilian crowds. These efforts led to Mossadegh's arrest and the consolidation of power by the Shah. Mohammad Mossadegh was arrested and tried by a military tribunal for treason and attempting to overthrow the monarchy. The 35-day trial was a spectacle. He dismissed the court's legality, defending himself as the rightful leader. Found guilty of defying the Shah's decree of dismissal, he was sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement. Though prosecutors sought death, the Shah commuted it to prison, followed by lifelong house arrest. The National Front and Toda Party organized strikes and protests, but these were ruthlessly crushed by the new military government. On 12th of November 1953, a major national resistance strike in Tehran led to clashes where security forces killed several students and arrested hundreds. This state of martial law effectively silenced public dissent. For the rest of the Shah's reign, any public mention of Mossadegh was banned, turning him into a silent symbol of the underground opposition. After the return of the Shah, what became apparent with the new 1954 consortium was the secret agreement between Eisenhower and Churchill to divide Iranian oil. American companies and the British each received 40%, with 14% going to Dutch Shell and 6% to Compagnie Française de Pétrole. Under this 50-50 profit-sharing deal, Iran received half the revenue from sales, but surrendered all operational control to the Western oil companies, effectively ending the dream of true oil independence. This funded the Shah's protection and the creation of the new SAVAK. Established in 1957 with CIA and Mossad assistance, SAVAK was the Shah's dreaded secret police. It functioned as an internal security and intelligence service tasked with liquidating dissent. They became infamous for pervasive surveillance, censorship, and the brutal torture and execution of political opponents, effectively turning Iran into a police state to ensure the monarchy's survival. After solidifying his power and securing funds for the national treasury, the Shah strove to follow in his father's footsteps by introducing reforms. His primary goals were to modernize the country and bolster Iran's economic power. The White Revolution of 1963 was born, a bold modernization drive featuring land reform and women's suffrage. Initially popular, it became a disaster that fractured society. Botched land redistribution turned peasants into displaced urban poor, while rapid westernization enriched only a small elite. These reforms deeply alienated the clergy and traditional merchants, who viewed them as a cultural poison. This forced shift, enforced by SAVAK, united the population against the Shah. To maintain control, he granted SAVAK even greater powers to censor the press and imprison thousands of dissidents, including communists, nationalists, and religious leaders. Ayatollah Khomeini was exiled because the Shah could neither imprison nor execute him. Such actions would have triggered a massive backlash from his followers and tarnished the Shah's reputation among his own supporters. Consequently, the Shah forced him out of the country. Unlike other dissidents who faced kidnapping or assassination abroad, the Shah declared the Ayatollah untouchable. Exiled to Turkey in 1964, Khomeini was initially isolated and ignored by global media. However, after moving to Najaf, Iraq, he was far from silent. He developed his revolutionary theories and smuggled recorded sermons into Iran via cassette tapes, maintaining a secret, powerful influence. The Shah and the West dismissed him for years, while he was building an underground movement. In 1971, Shah of Iran hosted a massive party at Persepolis to celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. He built a large tent city with air conditioning and imported food, chefs, and even the waiters from France. While kings and presidents attended, ordinary Iranians were kept away by thousands of soldiers. People were angry that so much money was spent on foreigners while many locals were poor. To them, the event felt like a sign that the Shah had lost touch with his own country. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini made a speech calling the Shah kafir, which means infidel and satanic, to describe Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and his regime. The Shah spoke out against this by saying, "In a moment of defiance, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi pushed back against rising clerical criticism, declaring he was probably more religious than those people. He insisted he believed in the true religion of God and the Prophet, not what had been added by those seeking profit, revealing a deepening divide between monarchy and clergy. When the Shah claimed to be more religious than a profiteering clergy, Khomeini fiercely rejected his legitimacy. He argued that only the ulama truly understood Islam, labeling the Shah's government a satanic regime, selling Iran to the West. To Khomeini, the clergy weren't profiteering. They were defending the faith against a monarch who had no right to speak for God. This exchange solidified the ideological divide that eventually fueled the 1979 revolution. War started in the Middle East, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. In response, the United States provided significant military aid and $2.2 billion in funding to resupply Israel. To retaliate, the Arab members of OPEC, used oil as a weapon. They imposed an embargo to pressure the U.S. and its allies to stop supporting Israel and to regain territory lost in previous conflicts. The 1973 oil embargo was led by OAPEC, Arab members of OPEC plus Egypt and Syria. Directed by Saudi Arabia, participants included Kuwait, Libya, Algeria, Iraq, Qatar, and the UAE. It targeted the US, UK, Netherlands, Canada, and Japan for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. While most Arab states cut production, Iran notably refused to join. The crisis caused global fuel shortages and quadrupled prices before ending in March 1974. The Shah of Iran was not part of the embargo and saw an opportunity to increase the oil prices. He sold to all targeted countries by the embargo and made a fortune from it. The elite grew tremendously rich. Those close to the Shah, whether through his companies or aristocratic ties, saw a massive boom in wealth, transforming Tehran's skyline. He used the Pahlavi Foundation to blur state and private funds, owning stakes in 17 banks and dozens of factories. He funded military expansion and great civilization projects, though inequality fueled the 1979 revolution. He transformed Tehran into a high-rise petroleum capital. Key projects included the Marble Azadi, Shayad Tower, and the massive Ekbatana complex, one of the world's largest housing developments. Commercial icons like the Plasko Building and luxury hotels like the Royal Tehran Hilton and Intercontinental defined the skyline. The Shah also planned Sharistan Pahlavi, a futuristic district of skyscrapers and embassies, though the 1979 revolution halted its completion. He commissioned iconic structures like the Karaj, Amir Kabir, dam for Tehran's water and the Dez Dam, then one of the world's highest, to electrify Khuzestan. Millions were spent on canal systems to transform arid land into commercial farms, though this often displaced traditional small-scale farmers. He funded the Health Corps, which deployed university graduates to rural areas for their military service. The Red Lion and Sun Society, now Red Crescent, built dozens of hospitals and clinics. The Shah launched a massive educational expansion. Primary school enrollment surged from 1.6 million to over 4 million, and the number of university students tripled. He funded the Literacy Corps, sending educated conscripts to rural villages to teach, while he built schools and modernized curriculum to create a Western-style workforce. The rapid change alienated traditionalists and religious leaders, unintentionally fueling the 1979 revolution. The Shah directed a significant portion of oil wealth, roughly $20 billion between 1973 and 1978, into purchasing advanced weaponry from the United States, procurement of high-end aircraft, including the F-14 Tomcat, funding for modern artillery, modern naval vessels, and comprehensive military training programs. Iran opened its first steel mill in Isfahan and heavily exploited domestic copper reserves to diversify the economy. The government expanded domestic vehicle production, exporting cars to countries like Egypt and Yugoslavia by the early 1970s. With Soviet assistance, the 690-mile Iranian gas trunk line was completed to export gas to the USSR in exchange for industrial and military credits. The Shah also invested heavily in restoring famous historic mosques to showcase Iranian heritage. Major orders were given to restore the Safavid-era Shah Mosque in Isfahan and the Sheikh Lotfallah Mosque, which included replacing vast areas of mosaic tilework that had been neglected for decades. The Shah also invested heavily to turn Iran into a global sports power, centering on the 1974 Asian Games in Tehran. He built the massive Aryamer, now Azadi, sports complex, featuring a 100,000-seat stadium and world-class aquatic centers. Other projects included the Amjadiya Stadium renovation and the Imperial Country Club. By making sports mandatory in schools and funding elite training, he aimed to host the Olympics and project an image of a modern, great civilization. The Shah invested in transforming cities into cosmopolitan centers by building modern theaters, high-end shopping malls, and elite leisure resorts. These projects aimed to replace traditional bazaars and communal spaces with Western-style infrastructure. He encouraged the youths and students to have fun, promoted and invested in nightclubs and restaurants. He challenged the youth to prepare for the year 2000, promising that through investment in technology, science, and education, Iran would match the progress of Western European countries. By the mid-1970s, the Shah was secretly diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The illness, combined with the heavy medication he took to treat it, significantly drained his energy and mental clarity. This physical decline led to a paralysis of leadership. Once a decisive autocrat, he became hesitant and detached. He struggled to choose between iron-fisted repression and liberal concessions, ultimately doing neither effectively, which created a fatal power vacuum at the top. Despite escalating violence, the demonstrations became a daily occurrence that the state could no longer contain. SAVAK, despite its reputation for brutality, found itself completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the unrest. The secret police and military were unable to process the thousands of arrests needed to break the movement's momentum, as the security apparatus began to buckle under the pressure. The fear that once kept the population in check evaporated, emboldening millions. In a desperate final move on the 6th November 1978, the Shah delivered a televised speech declaring, "I have heard the voice of your revolution." He asked for forgiveness and promised to amend past mistakes, but the move backfired. Rather than calming the public, the apology was seen as a confession of weakness and guilt. Sensing the end was near, the opposition intensified their demands for his total abdication, viewing his plea as the final white flag of a collapsing regime. Instead of calming the public, the speech was seen as a sign of weakness and desperation. From his exile in France, Ayatollah Khomeini immediately rejected the Shah's promises as worthless and called for continued strikes and protests. The revolution shifted from street clashes to economic warfare. A massive general strike took hold, most notably in the oil industry. This effectively brought the government to a standstill as the country's primary source of revenue vanished and basic services collapsed. To stabilize the country, the Shah tried appointing different leaders, including General Gholam Reza Ajari, headed a military government that failed to restore order. Shapur Bakhtiar, a longtime critic of the Shah, appointed as prime minister in a last-ditch effort to create a constitutional monarchy. However, Bakhtiar was immediately denounced by his own party and Khomeini for working with the Shah. As the Shah was departing Iran on 16th of January 1979, he made several remarks to officials and in a formal statement, framing his departure as an extended vacation to help ease the country's political turmoil. To Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar, he stated, "I give Iran into your care, yours and God's." To the nation, he expressed hope that the new government would make up for the past and also lay the foundations for the future through cooperation and patriotism. The Shah's 1979 departure for Egypt was disguised as a state visit to discuss the Camp David Accords. Distrusting his crew, he personally piloted his Boeing 707. While President Sadat initially provided a grand state welcome, he was unaware the Shah was entering permanent exile. Facing intense pressure from other Arab nations who viewed the Shah as a liability, Sadat was eventually forced to ask his friend to leave Egypt, beginning the Shah's long search for a permanent home. The U.S. encouraged King Hassan II to host the Shah to keep him away from the American mainland during the revolution's peak. In Morocco, the Shah's 4 youngest children joined him after being flown from the U.S. by Ambassador Ardashir Zahedi. Despite the reunion, King Hassan remained cautious, keeping the visit strictly private to avoid jeopardizing ties with Iran's new regime. Under growing international pressure, the Shah left Morocco for the Bahamas in March 1979. He was then invited in Cuernavaca. The Shah's health failed as his secret cancer, initially misdiagnosed as malaria, caused severe jaundice. Despite his public facade, he was mortally ill. Under immense pressure from David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, President Carter reluctantly granted him entry for humanitarian reasons. The Shah arrived at New York Hospital on the 22nd of October 1979, an event that ignited the Tehran hostage crisis just days later. Ayatollah Khomeini utilized the Shah's medical arrival in New York to fuel anti-American sentiment, famously branding the U.S. as the Great Satan. He dismissed the Shah's cancer as a white blood plague and a ruse for another U.S.-backed coup. When student militants seized the embassy on 4th of November 1979, Khomeini endorsed the act to demand the Shah's extradition, famously declaring that America can't do a damn thing to stop them. After being discreetly treated at New York Hospital, the Shah was moved to Panama, Contadora Island, in December 1979. He left Panama abruptly to avoid a 450-page extradition request from the new Iranian government. He returned to Egypt in March 1980, where President Anwar Sadat granted him permanent political asylum. He stayed in Egypt under the protection of Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. The U.S. government promised to take care of his illness and send specialists to Egypt to cure his lymphatic cancer. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died in Cairo on the 27th of July 1980 from complications of lymphatic cancer. He was given a state funeral with full military honors and buried in this historic Al-Rafai Mosque in Cairo, Egypt. The funeral was attended by his wife Empress Farah Pahlavi, his son Reza Pahlavi, former U.S. President Richard Nixon, and former King Constantine II of Greece. Ironically, he is buried in the same mosque as his former brother-in-law, King Farouk I, and his father, Reza Shah, was also temporarily interred there years earlier. Less than 2 months after the Shah's death, Saddam invaded Iran on 22nd in September 1980. Saddam Hussein's decision to invade Iran was driven by a combination of long-standing territorial disputes, ideological clashes, and a perceived opportunity to become the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. He also feared that Iran might support the Shiite majority in Iraq to take power. Saddam sought to annex Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province. He justified this by claiming the region's ethnic Arab majority were oppressed and would welcome Iraqi liberation, though most remained loyal to Iran. Most Arab nations, except Syria and Libya, supported Iraq by providing billions in loans and gifts. Saudi Arabia, $30.9 billion, Kuwait, $8.2 billion, and the UAE, $8 billion. The Soviet Union were Iraq's primary arms supplier, providing about half of all foreign aid to the country. This included advanced MiG-29 fighters, thousands of tanks, and Scud missiles. While officially neutral, the U.S. tilted toward Iraq to prevent an Iranian victory, provided critical battlefield intelligence and satellite imagery to help Iraqi combat planning, billions of dollars in economic aid and agricultural credits, allowed the export of dual-use technology that could be repurposed for military use. France was Iraq's second-largest military supplier, providing high-tech equipment like Mirage F-1 fighters and Exocet missiles. Iraq's surprise invasion did achieve significant early success, and they quickly captured border towns like Qasr-e-Shirin and Meran. Their most significant victory was the capture of Khorramshahr in October 1980, after a brutal month-long battle. Iran lost a vast amount of territory. Its military was in a state of complete chaos. While the Shah had built one of the world's most powerful militaries, the 1979 revolution dismantled its effectiveness just months before Saddam Hussein attacked. The revolutionary government deeply distrusted the regular Artesh army, viewing it as loyal to the deposed Shah. Between 2,000 and 4,000 high-ranking officers, experienced pilots, and senior commanders were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. This led to chaotic defense deployment by Iran of inexperienced military to recapture these territory but failed, and thousands were captured by the Iraqi forces. However, by 1981, the tide turned as Iran deployed the IRGC and young Mossadegh volunteers, some just 13, in human wave attacks. By 1982, Iran recaptured its land and liberated Khorramshahr. Instead of peace, Khomeini invaded Iraq to overthrow Saddam, leading to a brutal 6-year stalemate. By 1982, Iran recaptured its lands, culminating in the liberation of Khorramshahr. Bolstered by success in Kurdish rebels, KDP-PK, harrying Iraq's north, Khomeini launched Operation Ramadan to seize Basra. He expected Iraq's Arab Shiite majority to welcome them as liberators and rise up against Saddam. Instead, they remained loyal to Iraq or stayed neutral. Without a domestic uprising, Iranian forces were decimated by Iraqi chemical weapons and entrenched defenses, failing to take the city. The war became a brutal stalemate resembling World War I, with trench warfare and massive casualties. Iraq used chemical weapons and airstrikes in the War of the Cities to break Iranian morale. But both sides were steadfast and showed no significant advantage. By 1982, Iran was also sending approximately 1,500 Revolutionary Guard, IRGC trainers to Lebanon, following the Israeli invasion. They did not engage in direct combat, but instead provided the funding, guerrilla training, and ideological indoctrination that unified various Shia factions into Hezbollah. This deployment established Hezbollah as Iran's primary regional proxy, allowing Tehran to export its revolution and pressure Western and Israeli interests far beyond its own borders. By mid-1982, Iraq sought a ceasefire because its initial offensive had failed, and the tide of war had turned dramatically in Iran's favor. Iranian forces have now invaded Iraq, threatening Saddam Hussein's regime with total collapse. Facing a resurgent Iran, Saddam needed to stop the fighting to preserve his power, save his remaining military from destruction, and rebuild Iraq's devastated economy. Saddam Hussein used the Israeli invasion of Lebanon as a diplomatic pretext to stop the war. He offered to withdraw all Iraqi forces and establish a ceasefire so both nations could jointly fight Israel and support the Palestinians. Iran requested passage through Iraq for its troops to reach Lebanon. But when Saddam made this conditional on a ceasefire, Khomeini rejected it. Khomeini argued it was too late for such an alliance and dismissed the offer as a trap to save Iraq's weakened regime. Khomeini famously stated that peace with the criminal is a crime against Islam. He insisted the war would not end even if Iraqis left Iranian territory, demanding Saddam's removal and war reparations. Khomeini viewed the conflict as a holy struggle between justice and injustice, and a chance to export the revolution. Iraq was seeking UN intervention after periods of Iranian military success, such as when Iranian forces recaptured territory and began invading Iraq in 1982. Iraq sought peace to preserve its government and prevent the export of Iran's Islamic Revolution. Iraq typically accepted UN Security Council Resolution 514, 522, and 598, calling for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all forces to recognized boundaries. After UN Resolution 598 passed, President Reagan took a firm stand. He declared the Persian Gulf vital to Western security and freedom of navigation essential. He warned Iran to accept the ceasefire or face international sanctions. Reagan stressed that the U.S. would not let Iran dictate the use of these sea lanes or allow the region to become a choke point for freedom. He maintained a naval presence to protect shipping and deter further aggression. Next day, it was Iran's turn to address the assembly. For the first time since the revolution, the Islamic Republic of Iran's government had an opportunity to address the world at the United Nations. Iran's President Ali Khamenei, who later will become the supreme leader in Iran, takes the stage. Khamenei's UN response was pure fire. Just one day after Reagan's demand for a ceasefire, Khamenei hit back, calling the U.S. version of events "pack of lies." he famously threatened retaliation for the U.S. attack on the Iran Qajar, warning that bitter consequences would haunt the Americans far beyond the Persian Gulf. Dismissing UN Resolution 598, he insisted that peace was impossible until Iraq was punished, leaving the U.S. delegation to walk out in protest. After the refusal, President Reagan signed Executive Order 12614, banning nearly all Iranian imports, including oil, and strictly limiting exports of dual-use goods. He also destroyed Iranian oil platforms in Operation Nimble Archer and Operation Praying Mantis, physically crippling Iran's ability to export its most vital resource. On July 3, 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus A300, with 290 people on board. The U.S. Navy mistakenly identified the plane as a hostile F-14 Tomcat fighter during a skirmish with Iranian gunboats. Despite the tragedy occurring in Iranian airspace, the U.S. initially defended the crew's actions, citing combat stress. By this time, Saddam Hussein launched another offensive to recapture Iranian border cities and push through to the oil fields, this time with new military equipment and the use of chemical weapons. Iran's intelligence have declared the U.S. will enter the war, and the Soviet Union might join in from the north. This pushed Iran to accept the UN Resolution 598 and to stop the war. By 1988, Iran was exhausted. Years of war had crippled its economy and depleted its military. The final straw came from two fronts: Iraqi chemical weapon attacks, which caused mass casualties, and the accidental U.S. shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655, which convinced Tehran that the U.S. was ready for full-scale intervention. Realizing the war was unwinnable, Khomeini finally accepted the ceasefire, describing the decision as more lethal than drinking from a poisoned chalice. The war left Iran with nearly 1 million dead and a crippled economy. With oil revenues halved and infrastructure in ruins, the nation entered the Reconstruction era. President Rafsanjani launched a pragmatist economy-first policy, pursuing market reforms and a cautious opening to the West. Meanwhile, the conflict entrenched hardliners like Ali Khamenei and transformed the IRGC into a dominant political and economic force, setting the stage for Iran's modern regional strategy. Khamenei's health had been failing for years, starting with a heart attack in 1986. By 1989, his condition turned critical due to stomach cancer. He was admitted to a hospital for emergency surgery to stop heavy bleeding in his digestive tract. Though the operation was initially called a success, his recovery failed. In just 10 days, he suffered 5 massive heart attacks. At age 89, man who led the Islamic Revolution finally succumbed to organ failure and internal bleeding. On June 3, 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini died following a series of heart attacks, just 1 year after the war ended. His passing triggered a massive outpouring of grief, with an estimated 10 million people, 1/6 of the population, attending his funeral in Tehran. The chaos was so intense that his body was nearly mobbed, forced in a private burial later that day. His death marked the end of the revolutionary founding era and led to the swift appointment of Ali Khamenei as the new supreme leader. The mausoleum of Ruhollah Khomeini is a massive complex located in Tehran. Spanning over 20 square kilometers, it was designed to be one of the largest religious structures in the world. The central dome, covered in gold, is surrounded by 4 91-meter minarets, symbolizing Khomeini's age at his death. Inside, his tomb rests within a silver and gold cage-like structure called a zari. It serves as both a site of pilgrimage and a powerful symbol of the Islamic Republic's enduring legacy. After Khomeini's death, Iran faced a power vacuum. In the 1989 session, a hesitant Khomeini admits he is not qualified for the job, warning that the nation should weep tears of blood if he is chosen. The footage reveals he was actually appointed as a temporary leader for just 1 year. But through a swift constitutional referendum and Rafsanjani's political maneuvering, that 1-year trial became a lifetime of absolute rule. The temporary leader never stepped down. To secure the new leadership, The 1989 constitutional changes rewrote the rules of power. The most critical move was removing the requirement that the supreme leader be a marja, top religious authority. This allowed the lower-ranking Khamenei to qualify. The amendments also abolished the office of prime minister, concentrating executive control in the presidency. Finally, the leader's power was made absolute, granting him ultimate authority over the judiciary, military, and state media. The IRGC's rise transformed Iran into a regional heavyweight. After the war, the Guard moved into the boardroom, seizing control of up to one-third of the economy. Simultaneously, the elite Quds force began exporting the revolution. By funding and training the axis of resistance, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, the IRGC built a ring of fire around its rivals. This strategy allowed Iran to project power across the Middle East without ever firing a shot from its own soil. The world first learned about Iran's clandestine program in August 2002. An exiled opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, held a press conference in Washington to expose two massive secret sites, a uranium enrichment plant in Natanz and a heavy water facility in Arak, Desu. Satellite imagery soon confirmed the construction, igniting a global crisis. International inspectors later discovered that Iran had been concealing these activities for nearly 2 decades, leading to the first wave of UN sanctions. The discovery in 2002 sparked a decade-long diplomatic standoff. The U.S. accused Iran of an across-the-board pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, while Tehran insisted its intentions were purely peaceful. Under immense pressure, Iran signed the additional protocol in 2003, allowing for snap inspections. However, this cooperation was short-lived. By 2005, newly elected President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad ended the freeze on enrichment, leading the UN Security Council to impose the first of many waves of crippling economic sanctions. The UN sanctions began in December 2006 with Resolution 1737, passed after Iran ignored a final warning to stop enrichment. These were smart sanctions, specifically targeting the nuclear and missile programs rather than the whole economy. They banned the supply of nuclear technology, froze the assets of key scientists, and even prohibited the specialized training of Iranian students abroad. It was a global attempt to put a leash on Tehran's ambitions.
Good afternoon, everyone.
When Barack Obama took office, Iran intensified lobbying efforts in Washington, including through the National Iranian American Council, seeking a diplomatic opening. Initially cautious, Obama pursued a strategy to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions without war. In 2015, he advanced a landmark agreement designed to extend Iran's breakout time from weeks to over a year by limiting key capabilities, tasking John Kerry to lead negotiations. The negotiations led by John Kerry and his Iranian counterpart, Mohammad Javad Zarif, culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The agreement placed strict limits on Iran's nuclear program, reducing centrifuges, capping uranium enrichment, and allowing inspections, in exchange for sanctions relief, aiming to delay any potential path to a nuclear weapon. In return, the deal offered Iran major sanctions relief. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the US, EU, and UN agreed to lift nuclear-related sanctions, unlocking billions in frozen assets and allowing Iran to re-enter global oil markets and banking systems. However, non-nuclear sanctions, linked to terrorism and human rights, remained in place, keeping pressure on Tehran even as the agreement took effect.
Thank you very much. My fellow Americans, as President of the United States, my highest obligation is to ensure the safety and security of the American people. History has shown that the longer we ignore a threat, the more dangerous that threat becomes. For this reason, upon taking office, I've ordered a complete strategic review of our policy toward the rogue regime in Iran.
When Donald Trump entered office, he reversed course. In 2018, he withdrew the U.S. from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, calling it flawed. He reimposed sweeping sanctions, targeting Iran's oil and banking sectors under a maximum pressure campaign. The aim was to force a broader deal. But instead, tensions rose, and Iran began stepping away from its nuclear commitments. After the U.S. reimposed sanctions in 2018, Iran's economy plunged. Oil exports collapsed, the currency lost value, and inflation surged. Prices soared, jobs disappeared, and daily life grew harder for millions. Though aimed at pressuring the government, the impact hit ordinary people most. As tensions rose, Iran responded by stepping back from its nuclear commitments, deepening the crisis. As sanctions tightened and isolation deepened, Iran looked east. In 2023, it applied to join the BRICS bloc, an alliance of emerging economies seeking alternatives to Western dominance. By January 2024, Iran was officially admitted, marking a strategic shift. The move aimed to boost trade, bypass sanctions, and strengthen ties with countries like China and Russia in a changing global order. After the inauguration of the second Trump presidency, Washington revived a strategy of maximum pressure, demanding that Iran return to negotiations under strict conditions. The U.S. called for a complete halt to uranium enrichment, limits on ballistic missiles, and an end to support for regional proxy groups. Backed by sanctions and military threats, these demands aimed to force Tehran into a new, more restrictive nuclear agreement. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and Iran's leadership rejected the demands with defiance, portraying U.S. diplomacy as deception. Khamenei warned that Washington offers an olive branch, but its words are barbed wire, signaling deep mistrust. Tehran refused to negotiate under pressure, insisting sanctions must be lifted first, and declared that Iran would resist rather than submit, framing the standoff as a defense of sovereignty and dignity. At the indirect talks in Oman, the United States and Iran communicated through mediators, calling the meeting a cautious good start. But optimism faded quickly. Follow-up talks stalled as both sides hardened demands, sanctions relief versus nuclear limits. As diplomacy unraveled, tensions surged. Soon after, a sudden military strike shook the region, marking a dangerous turn from fragile negotiation to open escalation. Under cover of darkness, a formation of B-2 Spirit bombers moved into position, entering from multiple vectors to avoid detection. Flying long range from distant bases, they carried precision bunker-busting munitions aimed at hardened targets. At nearly the same moment, a submerged U.S. Navy attack submarine launched Tomahawk cruise missiles, striking complementary sites. The tightly synchronized assault unfolded within minutes, maximizing surprise and impact.
Thank you very much. A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan.
The strikes relied on bunker-buster munitions designed to penetrate deep underground before detonating, necessary for targets built to survive conventional attacks. They were used against the Isfahan uranium research reactor facility, Natanz and Fordow uranium enrichment plant, not reactors. Unlike reactors that generate power, these facilities process uranium to higher purities, making them central to nuclear capability and thus priority targets.
After the strikes, U.S. Secretary of War Hegseth cast the operation as a show of American power, portraying it as precise, deliberate, and meant to restore deterrence. In Washington's telling, the message was clear. The United States was willing to use overwhelming force against fortified nuclear targets, while warning Tehran that any further escalation would bring even greater consequences. Ali Khamenei struck a defiant tone, warning that any attack would be met in kind, declaring Iran would strike back if provoked. Yet despite the rhetoric, Tehran avoided direct confrontation with U.S. forces. Instead, Iran redirected its response toward Israel, launching missiles and drones while framing its actions as retaliation, balancing defiance with caution to avoid a wider war with Washington. A fragile calm followed, not from trust, but necessity. Back-channel diplomacy, economic strain, and the risk of a wider regional war pushed both sides toward restraint. Iran sought time to stabilize internally under sanctions, while the United States weighed the cost of escalation. The 6-month pause became an uneasy truce, less a peace agreement, more a calculated break to prevent the conflict from spiraling further. Donald Trump openly encouraged Iranians to rise up, urging them to keep protesting and take control of their future. As demonstrations spread across Tehran, crowds chanted against the regime, with some calling for Reza Pahlavi. In response, Ali Khamenei condemned the unrest, accusing the U.S. of inciting chaos and vowing that those involved would face punishment. After the unrest, Ali Khamenei addressed the nation, emphasizing unity and warning against foreign influence. In the days that followed, large gatherings appeared across Tehran, where participants expressed support for the government and opposition to external pressure. State institutions and media covered the events widely, presenting them as a response to recent tensions and a sign of public alignment during a period of uncertainty.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
On February 28, 2026, Donald Trump, speaking from his Mar-a-Lago estate in Palm Beach, Florida, gave the announcement of Operation Epic Fury, marking a decisive shift from pressure to open war. The operation was framed as a preemptive move to dismantle Iran's military and nuclear capabilities. Within hours, preparations accelerated, setting the stage for one of the most intense coordinated strike campaigns in modern conflict.
We are winning.
As the opening strikes of the war unfolded, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in a targeted attack on Iran's leadership. Within hours, Tehran responded. Ballistic missiles were launched toward U.S. bases across the Gulf and toward Israel, marking the shift from surprise assault to full-scale retaliation. The sequence was rapid: decapitation first, then response, setting the tone for a fast-moving and escalating conflict. As tensions escalated, Donald Trump issued stark warnings. He threatened to destroy Iran's infrastructure, bridges, power plants, and energy systems if Tehran refused his terms. He warned strikes could come rapidly, even suggesting the country could be pushed back to the Stone Age. With the risk of widespread devastation growing, fears of a broader war set the stage for urgent calls for mediation. As tensions spiraled, Shehbaz Sharif stepped into a delicate role. Maintaining ties with both Iran and the United States, he called urgently for a ceasefire, warning that the conflict risked destabilizing the entire region. Positioning Pakistan as a bridge rather than a side, Sharif urged restraint, emphasizing dialogue over escalation at a moment when war threatened to spread beyond control. Donald Trump agreed to Shehbaz Sharif's call for a ceasefire, opening the door for talks in Islamabad, marking a shift from escalation toward cautious diplomacy. As diplomacy began, Shehbaz Sharif first received Iran's delegation in Islamabad. Led by the foreign minister and parliament speaker, the talks focused on ceasefire terms and Tehran's conditions. The meeting reflected Iran's preference for indirect negotiation, using Pakistan as a channel rather than engaging Washington directly, as tensions remained high. Soon after, Shehbaz Sharif met the American delegation, including J.D. Vance and senior envoys. Discussions focused on de-escalation, security guarantees, and the conditions for halting further strikes. Rather than direct engagement with Iran, messages were relayed through Pakistani intermediaries, turning Islamabad into a diplomatic bridge. Despite the high-level talks, deep mistrust remained, leaving the path to peace uncertain.
We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement.
As J.D. Vance confirmed that no deal had been reached, diplomacy appeared stalled. The language of power, terms, conditions, and red lines remained unchanged. But beyond closed rooms and official statements, another story was unfolding, one not shaped by governments, but by millions of Iranians whose lives continue between pressure from outside and change from within. Iran is a nation shaped by pride, but also by longing. Beneath politics and power, its people share something deeper, a desire to belong, not in isolation, but as part of the wider world. And when that connection is threatened by war, pressure, or influence, they unite, not always for the system, but for the country itself. Iran today is not the Iran of 1979. Beneath the structure of the Islamic Republic, a different force is already in motion: its people. Change is no longer something waiting to happen. It is unfolding quietly, daily, from within society itself. Not always loud, not always visible, but present in how people live, think, and express who they are. This is a country where nearly 60% of the population is under 39, educated, connected, and fully aware of the world beyond its borders. They understand global culture, technology, and politics. They are not disconnected, they are engaged. And with that awareness comes expectation to live with dignity, opportunity, and a voice in shaping their future. History shows that change in Iran has never come from outside. It came from its people, from the fall of dynasties to the rise of new systems. And each time, the promise was the same: protection, dignity, independence. But the desire beneath it all never disappeared, the desire to move forward, not backward. Pressure from abroad does not always break a system. It can harden it. Sanctions, isolation, and threats often tighten control, not loosen it. Yet beneath that pressure, something else grows quietly: awareness, creativity, resilience. A society adapting, evolving, waiting for the moment when change feels possible. This is not a revolution as the world once knew it. It is quieter, deeper, happening within institutions, within culture, within everyday life. Iran is not standing still. It is changing, gradually, internally, towards something new, shaped not by collapse, but by evolution. This documentary was created through careful research, time, and a commitment to telling a balanced story. If it resonated with you, consider sharing it, liking it, and joining the conversation by leaving your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us continue producing independent, in-depth content. And if you'd like to contribute further, your support allows us to keep telling stories that matter.
شب آرام با صدای باد زمین خاموش آسمان نزد غم هست گم می شود دل در سکوت ترم می گیرد در این لحظه بی زبان نفسم با شب هم هرچی بود دور می شود فقط نور می ماند زیر نور زیر نور دلم آرام میگیرد زیر نور زیر نور روحم بیدار می شود زیر نور زیر نور در سکوت این شب من با خودم باز میگردم زیر یاد یک قدم روی خط یاد یک